These are some of the most terrifying unsolved mysteries of all time. So there are a ton of true crime cases that remain unsolved, and I think it's really interesting to talk about because about every single one of these cases, there is someone out there who knows something. We're gonna start with the disappearance of the Sodder children. This is one of the craziest unsolved cases that I've ever heard. It is truly terrifying, and to this day, it remains completely unsolved. So this happened on Christmas Eve of 1945 in a quiet house in the hills above Fayetteville, West Virginia. So who lived at this house was a big Italian-American family, the Sodders. They had 10 children, a trucking business, and a 5-bedroom, 2-story frame house that was just a couple miles north of Fayetteville, West Virginia. Before they lived in West Virginia, they lived in Italy, and George Sodder, the father, was very known for speaking his mind, and he was very anti-Mussolini. Like, this was something that he would argue with people about, and especially even in the active Italian community of West Virginia. This was something that he would like make enemies over because he was so anti-Mussolini, and that will become a key piece later in the story. So basically what happened is on the night of Christmas Eve of 1945 in West Virginia, this house went on fire after midnight, and George and his wife Jenny ended up escaping with 4 of their children, and 5 of their kids, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and little Betty, didn't make it out of the upstairs. At sunrise, the firefighters sift through the ruins, and there are no bodies, no bones, no evidence of them whatsoever. And we're gonna go deeper into detail with that, but that is what happened. So let's talk about some of the things that happened leading up to the fire. There were a couple things here that were a little weird. So a stranger allegedly wandered on the property and peered at the 2 fuse boxes and casually said, "This is gonna start a fire someday." Obviously, you know, a little weird, but maybe not incriminating. However, and there was a life insurance salesman who came to the door, and when George wasn't buying life insurance, he said, "Your house will go up in smoke, your children will be destroyed. That's what you get for the things that you've said about Mussolini." I mean, it's pretty on the nose there. Like, I can't lie. What? Like, I don't know. Around the same time, the family noticed that there was a man in a parked car just like watching the younger kids walk home from school, but for some reason, none of that felt actionable. They didn't do anything about it, but these coincidences obviously matter later on. So the night of the fire, December 24th, 1945, the family celebrated Christmas. The older sons, John and George Jr., share an upstairs room and go to sleep. The 5 younger kids, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, settle on different beds in the 2 upstairs bedrooms. Their eldest daughter, Marianne, dozes off on the sofa, and their baby Sylvia, who's 2 years old, sleeps in her parents' bed. So sometime after midnight, between 12:30 and 1 a.m., the house phone rings, and Jenny answers it, and a woman's voice asks for a man that doesn't live there. She claimed that there was party noise in the background, clinking glasses, laughter, and Jenny just said that it was really weird. But she hung up, and on the way back to bed, she noticed the things that the kids who stayed up later were supposed to do. Like, the lights were turned on, and they didn't pull the curtains or lock the doors. So she locks the doors, draws the curtains, turns off the lights, and then heads back to bed. While she's laying in bed, she hears a sharp thud on the roof and a rolling sound, and then silence, and then moments later, the house is on fire. Just after 1 a.m., Jenny wakes up George, and fire is already in the office near the fuse box. The staircase is quickly choked with heat and smoke. George shatters a window to reach the interior, slicing his forearm. The downstairs rooms, living room, dining room, kitchen. The parents are downstairs with some of the other siblings, and there is no way up. The stairs are completely on fire. So when George can't get up the stairs to save his other children, he decides to go outside and around the back to save them through the outside windows. George's plan was to take one of his 2 coal trucks and drive them like under the windows and climb up and open the window and get his kids out safely. However, both of his coal trucks were not starting that day, which obviously is weird. The eldest daughter, Marion, runs to a neighbor's house to call the fire department. The operator doesn't answer. Several other neighbors try to call the fire department. The operator's just not answering. I don't know. It's 1945, but you think they would have had it figured out by then? But maybe that's all part of a bigger conspiracy. So eventually, somebody has to physically go to the firehouse and get the chief to come to the house. So that means it's after 8 o'clock in the morning by the time the fire department arrives, which obviously at that point, the house is just a bunch of ash. And the 5 kids, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and little Betty, who were upstairs, were not in any of the rubble. They weren't able to save them. No one heard them them screaming or saying anything. They seemingly burnt down with the house. However, there were no signs of any human bones whatsoever. And that is something that a lot of people like to have an argument about. At least at the time, there was a lot of skepticism here because the family was like, what is happening? Like, at the time, the family was like, there should be bones, but then the policeman argued, like, obviously this was such a hot, fire and that can happen. But nonetheless, we figure out later that there definitely would have been bones had the children been there. So within a day, a state inspector comes and blames faulty wiring on the fire, and they gave the 5 children death certificates listed with fire or suffocation. And again, the family kept replaying details in their head. Jenny remembers that there were some lights that were still on in the early stages of the fire, which means that a faulty wiring probably wasn't what happened here. Later, a telephone repairman ended up saying that the line wasn't burned through, and in fact, it looked cut. A local thief later identified and arrested for stealing a block and tackle off of the property that night ends up admitting that he was the one who cut the line, thinking it was a power line, but he denied having any role in the fire whatsoever. And whatever that means, I don't know. And obviously that's a little strange, but still, nonetheless, the family was still skeptical and was absolutely not taking faulty wiring for an answer. And they were obviously also not accepting the fact that their children were in the fire because clearly they weren't. So crematories run at around 2000 degrees Fahrenheit for a couple of hours and still produce a substantial amount of bone fragments that would have been found in the fire. So a fast moving residential fire can get very hot in localized pockets, but if 5 bodies were trapped upstairs, you would definitely see bone. There's no doubt about it. There'd be teeth, something. So the official story here ended up being, of course, the electrical wiring, but of course rumors ended up swarming throughout the town. So a hotel manager in Charleston swears that she saw 4 of the missing children alive a week later, arriving near midnight with 2 men and 2 women of Italian descent. A woman at a tourist court between Fayetteville and Charleston said that she served the missing children breakfast the next morning, and she remembers seeing a car with Florida license plates. There are thousands of tips coming in at this point, and the Sodders are just desperately looking to find their children. They ended up hiring a local private investigator, C.C. Tinsley, and he ended up turning up with a lot of odd ends here that just don't really make a lot of sense. For one, the insurance salesman who literally threatened George about Mussolini and said, your house is going to burn down and your children are going to be gone. He sat at the coroner's jury, and he was one of the jurors that ruled that the fire was accidental. Don't like that. What do you mean by that? That's suspicious. I mean, come on. The fire chief ended up claiming that he found a human organ in the ashes and hid it in a dynamite box and buried it on the site. And for some reason, the chief said that he did this so that giving the family some sort of closure. But nonetheless, George and C.C. Tinsley ended up digging up the box, and the organ that they found was a beef liver. It was fresh, unburned. The chief literally planted it, hoping to give the family some sort of closure, which makes no sense. If anything, to me, it seems like the fire chief did that to make the family stop asking questions. So in August of 1949, 4 years after the fire, the Sodders ended up funding a more systematic excavation of the old basement, and they brought in a very respected pathologist from Washington, D.C. The crew turned up with small artifacts, including a half-burned dictionary, coins, and 4 lumbar vertebrae. So those go to the Smithsonian Institution for analysis, and all 4 pieces of the lumbar vertebrae were from one individual, not 5. There were 5 children there. And the bones also showed no evidence of exposure to fire, meaning they were probably introduced later with the filled dirt when he bulldozed the memorial. Also, based on fusion, the skeletal maturity fits around age 16 to 17, with an upper bound of about 22 years old, which doesn't fit any of the children who were missing. Also, the house burned for like 45 minutes. You would expect during this time, when there was still like pieces of their items, their home stuff, like some pots, pans, whatever, that weren't completely burned to ash, there would be full skeletons if all 5 children were in there, not just 4 pieces of vertebrae that clearly don't belong to any of these children. That is very concerning. And that's the closest thing that this case ever got science-wise. It obviously doesn't prove necessarily kidnapping, it doesn't prove arson, it just proves that either everyone burned away entirely, which is incredibly rare fire and probably definitely did not happen, or something darker happened, which obviously I'm leaning towards that. The Sodder family was obviously incredibly distraught by this entire thing. They ended up actually putting up a billboard on Route 16 with the kids' photographs and ages at the time and a reward that eventually reached $10,000. And that sign existed there for decades and became kind of a landmark and just showed how frustrated the Sodders were, not only with the fact that their children are missing and their house burned down, but also within the fire department of the Fayetteville area. So tips have never stopped. They are still happening to this day, where various people are claiming to see these children in different places. These tips have been coming in since this occurred and have not stopped. One day, George actually thought he saw his daughter's face in a New York newspaper photo of school children, so he drove to Manhattan. The family he questioned ended up shutting the door and just not answering anything, which to me is weird. Like, if you're accusing me of having an abducted child or missing child, I would want to prove that it wasn't her, you know? I don't know. Years later, in the 1960s, Jenny received an envelope postmarked from Kentucky, and inside a photograph was a young man in his mid-20s whose brows, eyes, and mouth looked uncannily like Louis, who was 9 at the time of the fire. On the back of the message, it said, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, lil boys A90, 132 or 35. And again, Jenny and George decided to send a private detective to follow up in Kentucky and try to find out where this letter came from, but the private investigator disappeared. What do you mean by that? That's obviously weird. Sadly, George passed away in 1969 with no answers, and then Jenny passed away in 1989, and that was when the billboard finally came down. But for the surviving children, especially Sylvia, who was 2 the night that it happened, and before her death in 2021, she still believed that her siblings escaped, and her children just never want this story to die. And I think that's really cool that people are still talking about it, because at the end of the day, somewhere out there, somebody knows something, and that's very frustrating. I feel so bad for this family that they didn't end up having any answers before they died. I just feel like the cops in this town were very concerning. Like, the detective work was very poor. Why didn't they go question the life insurance salesman who literally threatened George Sodder days before, saying exactly what was going to happen that did end up happening? I don't know why they didn't talk to him. Yeah, I just feel like this investigation was absolutely fumbled, maybe because it was of the time. I don't know, but either way, it is dark, and I really wonder exactly what could have happened to these children. So this is what the family believes and has believed the whole time. So they believe that someone cut the phone lines and removed the ladders and tampered with the trucks, and through this device that later was found in the yard that George believes resembled a pineapple bomb, and then used the fire to cover up the kidnapping of the 5 children. And why would anyone do this? Again, the motives seem to be around George's remarks about hating Mussolini. Other people think it could have been a debt or extortion dispute or a local ring seizing children. Who knows? But either way, this is a very dark thing that happened, and I just think it's strange how we really have no answers here. The thing that also doesn't really make sense is there was no ransom. There was no credible contact that ever emerged. How did all 5 kids get removed from the house without waking any of the other people in the house? There was no trail left whatsoever. I mean, yes, there were many sightings over the years, but obviously a lot of people look alike. So it's not that crazy to think could have been just other people at the end of the day. But how many coincidences are we gonna take and believe? You know, this case really got to a point where there were so many different little coincidences that people are trying to use to explain away what could have happened. But at the end of the day, we really have no clue what this could have been. In my opinion, I do think that the Sodder children are still alive, or were still alive at that time. I do think they were kidnapped or escaped or something, and maybe just sold into adoption agencies. I don't know. It's kind of complicated because, like, how were, you know, it's not just one kid, it's 5. Like, how are none of them ever found? That's kind of confusing. But the letters that people got, and then the private investigator going missing, like, all that stuff is very suspicious, you know? I don't like it. Either way, I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. What do you think could have happened here? Do you think that these kids just passed away in the fire somehow? I personally just think that's, like, basically impossible, but I really don't know what I think could have happened to them after the fact. I want to hear your guys' thoughts and opinions, because this case is something that, like, genuinely keeps me up at. Whenever I think about it, I'm just just like, what the hell happened here? What happened? But let us know your thoughts. All right, the next case that I want to talk about is about Dr. Sneha Phillip. So this woman is a young doctor who disappeared on the evening of September 10th, 2001, just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center, and she's like officially declared as a 9/11 victim, but there's a lot more to the story overall. So there's a lot of different opinions about what could have happened to Sneha, and I do think that it's important to talk about overall because I don't think it's as cut and dry as what the police have stated. So let's talk about who Sneha was. So she was a 31-year-old physician who had recently moved in with her husband, Dr. Ron Lieberman, to an apartment in Battery Park, New York. They were in walking distance to the Twin Towers, but she wasn't assigned to the Trade Center. She didn't work there. She was just a young doctor living in the neighborhood nearby. In the years leading up to September of 2001, her life was a little bit complicated. She had some work turbulence, like she was let go from a job because of her drinking habits, allegedly. Apparently this like type of behavior really started to worry her family. Her husband claims differently though. He's like, no, like she just liked to go out and party at night, and that's just kind of where it was left at for him. Also, Sneha had an experience that was unresolved of a disciplinary mess at the previous hospital that she was working at. So Sneha ended up filing a police report against one of her co-workers for alleged SA, and the district attorney ended up charging Sneha with filing a false report, even though she claims that this event happened and it was very disturbing to her. And her husband and her family say that her struggle with alcohol kind of creeped up during this time, like because she was SA'd by one of her coworkers and nobody was believing her. It was a very frustrating time, obviously. So on the morning of September 10th, 2001, Sneha pled not guilty after refusing to recant her statement and have all charges dropped. So the police offered her a deal that if she just took back her statement and said nothing ever happened, all of her charges would be dropped. And she was like, absolutely not. This person is guilty. And she pled not guilty, and that was that. And her husband, Ron, was with her at the court hearing, and then allegedly they got into a fight outside of the courthouse, but that has been denied by Ron. So I don't know, I guess it's hearsay at that point. Not really sure. So Ron ends up heading to work after the court hearing, and Sneha is off work that day, so she decides to go shopping. So she drops off some clothes at the neighborhood dry cleaner. She heads to a Century 21, the department store that's across from the Twin Towers. She buys lingerie, a dress, pantyhose, and bed linens, and then goes to another store and buys 3 pairs of shoes. The security cameras catch her moving throughout the store. Ordinary posture, steady tempo, and no one was with her. However, one of the store employees claim that another woman was with her. They were dressed similarly, and she claims that she was also Indian. But the security cameras were never able to corroborate that claim. But it is kind of a random thing for some store clerk to lie about, you know? But Sneha's credit card trail ends there. She never uses that card again or any other card. Her husband, Ron, ends up finishing his shift at Jacoby Medical Center in the Bronx. He gets home around midnight and finds the apartment empty. He waits around, calls around, no one answers, and he falls asleep on the couch expecting her to, you know, come in. But he was very stressed out because he and Sneha were allegedly kind of having some issues to an extent. Like Sneha was really into going out, and she would stay out all night and sleep over at her cousin's house or her brother's house. And her and Ron ended up having a serious talk about how he was fine with her wanting to go out and hang out and party and go to the clubs and stuff, but he would just like her to call him and let him know that she's okay or she's staying here or whatever the case may be. So Ron ends up waking up the morning of September 11th. There is no Sneha, there's no messages on the machine, so he heads to work. Also, there's a lot of alleged like allegations here with Sneha and like gay bars. Apparently she was going to a lot of lesbian bars, and there were a lot of conspiracy theories that she was bisexual. In fact, her brother allegedly made a statement to the detective and said that her and her brother ended up getting in a fight because he came home and found Sneha sleeping with his girlfriend, which is crazy. But then the brother claims that that actually never happened and he never had that conversation. So I don't know. Like, are they trying to protect her reputation, or did the detective just completely make this up? Like, I don't know. But nonetheless, she was going to lesbian bars. Ron claims there was nothing wrong in their relationship. There was no infidelity. They just worked very crazy shifts, and so they were never really able to go out together, and she liked going to the lesbian bars so that she wouldn't get hit on by men, especially after the SA that she experienced at the bar with her coworker. So anyway, Ron goes to sleep on that couch. He wakes up on September 11th of 2001, and Sneha is nowhere to be found. There were no messages left on the machine, and he is obviously concerned, but he heads to work and just assumes, okay, she didn't call. I'm a little bit annoyed by that, but she probably slept at her cousin's or her brother's house. Like, it's not a big deal. So he heads to work. Then obviously at 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 hits the North Tower. This was obviously a crazy moment in New York, and as soon as Ron heard about it, he obviously panicked. He lived a couple blocks from the World Trade Center. He doesn't know where his wife is or was last night, and he tried to call her, tried to call the apartment, and there was no luck. And Sneha also didn't have a cell phone, so he was calling like the landline in the apartment, hoping that she had returned after sleeping at her cousin's house. But he ended up calling her cousins, her brothers, her whole family, and none of them had heard from her at all. And the last security footage of her known is shopping at that Century 21 on September 10th. So Ron again tried to reach out, couldn't find her, and obviously he couldn't get home either, because if you don't know, when 9/11 happened, all of the phones were not working. The streets were literally insanely packed. They lived a couple blocks away from the World Trade Center. There was no way of him getting home, but he ended up riding home in an ambulance, because obviously emergency vehicles were allowed to be on those streets at the time, and it still took like 6 hours to get from the Bronx to Battery Park, which is insane. So he arrives home, but the apartment doors aren't working, so he has to stay at a friend's house that night, and then ends up the next day going back to the apartment and was able to open the door, and Sneha wasn't there. There was a lot of soot all around the apartment because one of the windows had been left open, but there were no footprints in the apartment, and all of Sneha's stuff had been left exactly as it was. So it's pretty obvious that Sneha did not return home since the morning of September 10th, 2001. So there's a few theories here. Ron obviously immediately panicked, and he thinks that his wife was abducted or hit by a car or something terrible happened to her the night before 9/11. And during this time, obviously there is chaos everywhere. Like, there's no way that the NYPD was really focusing on anything else. So he tried to get Sneha like registered as like a missing person and tried to get people talking about it, but obviously a unthinkable terror attack just happened. So the hospitals were busy, the police officers were busy. It was all just absolute chaos. And so there has been no trace of Sneha whatsoever since then. So let's get into the different theories as to what happened. So one theory, and I think the most popular theory / the most reasonable theory, is because Sneha was a doctor. She was probably spent the night out with somebody maybe that she didn't know, maybe someone that she had just met, maybe a secret lover. Who knows who she spent the night with, but she clearly spent the night out on September 10th. And then she went home on the morning of September 11th. There actually is footage of a woman who could be Sneha, but the way the sun rays were hitting the light of the camera, it's pretty impossible to tell for sure that it was her. But it's a woman standing at the elevator in the lobby of the apartment building that Sneha lived in. She is waiting for the elevator, but then she turns around and ends up leaving, which at that point, that was when the first plane hit the tower. So this person probably turned around to see what the hell that sound was, obviously. The thing is a lot of people don't think this was Sneha because she didn't have any shopping bags with her, and which she bought a lot of stuff when she was shopping. There definitely would have been shopping bags somewhere, but the person in the video had no shopping bags whatsoever. So like, where are these shopping bags? We still don't know. So the theory continues from there that she heard the crash and immediately ran out of the building, saw that the World Trade Center was on fire, and she's a doctor. She lived blocks away. She ran towards the towers to help people and ended up dying there from the collapse or from running into the building. Who knows? But that is the most common theory, and that is what the family has like accepted and believed. At first she was declared a 9/11 victim, but then later on they ended up revoking that status. But in 2008 they ended up reinstating it, and she was in fact legally declared as a 9/11 victim, but her family didn't get any of the compensation for it, which her husband did try to do, and tried to get the like $3 to $4 million that they would have gotten if she had been legally declared a 9/11 victim in like 2001, 2002. But because it was too late, that was just that. Which a lot of people think it's strange that her family went to court over it to like get her legally declared as a victim of 9/11. Honestly, I think it wasn't about the money because it had already passed the point of when they were compensating for this. So I don't know. I don't think it was really about the money. I think it's just like about closure for them. But a lot of people think that this is not actually what happened here, and I don't know what I think. A lot of people believe that Sneha was was maybe secretly bisexual or gay, and she wanted to live her life, but like maybe her family didn't approve of it, or she, you know, she had a husband at home, she just wanted to escape her old life. So she ended up leaving on September 10th, but then when 9/11 happened, and she kind of just used the chaos there to pretty much erase her trail. I don't know if I think that's true. Also, other people think that she could have been murdered or kidnapped or something on the night of September 10th. I don't know. I don't know here, because I think it's so strange that no one has said anything, because obviously Sneha wasn't alone that night. Like, she didn't sleep on the street that we know of. Like, you know what I mean? What likely happened here, even if she was a victim of 9/11 and she did go back to the World Trade Center to try to help people and ended up passing away in amidst the catastrophe, I still think there's a lot of questions unanswered. Like, for one, we know it wasn't that surprising for her to not stay the night at her house and to stay out all night. But the thing is that she was staying somewhere, and no one has come forward saying like, oh, she was with me. That's weird to me. Her cousins and her siblings, none of them were with her the night of September 10th, and we virtually have no idea where she was. We also have no idea where the bags went that night. It just doesn't really make sense. I think the theory of Sneha running from her apartment building to the Twin Towers when she heard the crash makes sense, but it doesn't make sense in this specific scenario because she wasn't at the apartment building. Where was she, and why do we not know? That's the part that will always get me. Like, yes, is this the most likely theory? Sure, but where are the bags? Where was she that night? Why hasn't anyone come forward saying that they were with her if, like, she did pass away 9/11? That clearly wouldn't have been the person that she was with's fault. What the hell happened here? I just think it's a possibility that something weird happened, okay? I also think it's kind of scary, but in like 2012, I think, there was a website that used to have like these like postcards that people would send in anonymously. Everyone that I used to know before 9/11 thinks that I'm dead, and a lot of people think that that's Sneha, even though obviously it could be a hoax, it could be somebody else, who knows? But either way, this case remains unsolved and probably will do so forever because she is legally declared as a 9/11 victim. So that's kind of where the story ends. But I want to hear your guys' thoughts on this. Do you think she could have escaped her life? Do you think that somebody hurt her? What do you think happened? I want to hear your thoughts. And also, if you guys want extra content on this channel, you can join my memberships. I just like unlocked that. Never done that before, but I figured there's some like videos that I really like doing and you guys like watching. But it's more of like a intimate audience that cares about these things, like specific like new Mandela effects and all of that stuff. So I'm going to be uploading extra content weekly on the memberships if you want more content. So that's that. But anyway, that is it. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, and subscribe for new videos every week, and I'll see you guys later. Bye.